9. Submarine K19. Built during the late 1950s as one of the Soviet Union's first generation of nuclear submarines, K19 was the rushed response to America's latest developments in nuclear sub-technology. It proved to be less than reliable, often encountering mechanical problems and getting into accidents. K19 almost sank numerous times, and more than 24 crew members died throughout its several catastrophes. But it wasn't decommissioned until 1990, and in 2002 it was towed to a shipyard with plans to be scrapped. Russian Navy veteran Vladimir Romanov, who once served on K19, couldn't bear to see it dismantled and forgotten, so he bought part of the submarine and transported the cabin to the banks of the Pavlovsky Reservoir. Romanov hoped to use the cabin as a meeting place for submarine veterans from Russia and other countries. The idea was controversial from the get-go, especially considering K19's tragic history, and Romanov's plans have received little support since then. For now, the salvage wheelhouse functions mostly as a monument, and the plans to turn it into a clubhouse seem to be on hold. 8. Hovercraft Train. During the 1960s, Britain attempted to develop a hovercraft train which would ride along a track atop a cushion of air created by strong fans. Its designers claimed it would be able to function in all types of weather, with a maximum speed of 300 miles per hour. Dubbed the RTV-31, it would transport passengers from London to Glasgow in 2 hours, 3 times faster than any existing train at the time. But that was only if everything went according to plan. Unfortunately, the hover pads were heavy and didn't function as effectively as engineers had hoped. The engine was huge and inconvenient to repair, and building the track would prove costly. There was also speculation from the inventor of the train's linear induction motor, Eric Laithwaite, that the RTV-31 would be unsafe. Eric proclaimed that there was a possibility for the vehicle to drive itself off the track. During its first test run, the train reached a disappointing maximum speed of just 12 miles per hour. The project rapidly lost support after that and was eventually cancelled in 1973. Today, the only surviving relic of the hover train is a single aging car that sits atop a portion of track in Peterborough, serving as a constant reminder of a failed endeavour that was once praised as the UK's up-and-coming new form of travel. 7. Spirit of Rochester. From 1986 to 2004, the Spirit of Rochester offered lunch and dinner cruises along the Genesee River in upstate New York. Today, it sits abandoned and continues to decay with an uncertain future. Named for the city it was based out of, the 156-foot boat had enough room for more than 500 passengers. Local businessman Donald Sir bought the vessel after the Rochester's 150th anniversary attracted thousands of visitors to the area in 1984. He figured the renewed interest in the local beach and harbour had created a viable market for cruises in nearby Lake Ontario. The boat underwent extensive restoration after its journey to Rochester from its previous home in Connecticut. When it opened to the public, passengers were given the options of a 2-hour lunch or a 3-hour dinner cruise. Business got off to a somewhat slow start, but eventually it picked up and became a hit among both locals and tourists. Sir paid off the debts from his startup costs within 2 years, and sales remained high until the Spirit of Rochester struck a sunken tugboat in 2004, which created a hole in the vessel's hull. The boat was towed to Rochester for repairs, but it failed to open for the 2006 season as planned. It was eventually sold to new owners, who began renovations but stopped at some point and left the boat behind. Since 2017, it's remained docked along the Genesee River with no clear plan for the future. In 2022, a viewer wrote to local station News 10 NBC, asking if the boat will at least be scrapped or taken out of the water. News correspondent Emily Putnam was unable to reach its current owner, but a State Department of Environmental Conservation spokesperson said that it would only fall under the agency's jurisdiction under certain circumstances, including if it poses a navigational hazard, starts leaking fuel, or otherwise becomes dangerous. 6. Drug smuggling subs. While patrolling in the Atlantic Ocean roughly 100 miles off Costa Rica one day in 2006, the crew of a US Coast Guard cutter spotted something strange in the water that they didn't immediately recognize. When they sailed closer, they saw what appeared to be 3 snorkels poking through the water's surface. Apparently, what they'd found was a homemade submarine. Inside were 4 men, as well as an AK-47 and a 3-ton shipment of cocaine. The Coast Guard seized the 49-foot vessel, which was nicknamed Bigfoot, and parked it in the water outside the Joint Interagency Task Force South in Key West, Florida. In 2009, Rear Admiral Joseph Nimitz told the New York Times that the Coast Guard heard rumors of the semi-submersible's existence long before its capture. According to Nimitz, it is just one of 3 that were captured that year. Bigfoot was built by hand in Colombia. It was an example of how the drug trade evolves along with law enforcement's ability to catch traffickers, and is just one of many narco submarines that have been captured since then. Over time, the name Bigfoot came to be a general term applied to many different smuggling subs for their somewhat mythical status, for being talked about but hardly ever seen. As David Kushner of the New York Times pointed out, building a submarine is a noticeable activity, and it's extremely difficult to carry out in secrecy. But cartels have resources, and the mangroves along Colombia's Pacific coast provide enough coverage to get the job done. And while traveling in a homemade submarine comes with obvious dangers, it pays well, especially since these vessels can carry much bigger shipments of drugs than boats that travel on the surface. Spotting these vessels can be tricky for authorities, not only because they travel mostly underwater, but because they're often painted dark blue or they're camouflaged to blend in with the sea. It's reportedly believed that dozens of narco submarines reach US shores undetected every year. For now, the so-called war on drugs continues, while abandoned and captured Bigfoot submarines increasingly appear along beaches and waterways. What do you think is the best means of transportation in the modern world? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. 5. Elvis Presley's jet. The king of rock and roll cut no corners when it came to enjoying his fortune. He owned 3 private planes that he used for both business and pleasure. Graceland sold the first 2, then bought them back and parked them on the property, where they remain on display today. Elvis bought the 3rd aircraft, a 1962 Lockheed Jetstar, as a Christmas gift to himself in 1976, just 8 months before his death. He paid $840,000 for it, which would be around $4.4 million today. The Elvis Presley estate sold the Jetstar shortly after his death. It was parked at Roswell International Air Center in New Mexico, and more or less forgotten about until relatively recently, when plans to auction it off were announced. Based on the dilapidated condition of the plane's exterior, it's clear it's been neglected for years. The engines and many of the cockpit components have been stripped, and the paint is visibly faded. The interior contains swiveling or red velvet seating for 6 passengers, gold and suede trimmings, and a red carpet. There's also a bathroom with a vanity, a VCR, and cassette players, which would have been high-tech features at the time. By all appearances, it was most likely customized to Elvis's liking, but it's unclear how much he used the jet in the short time he owned it. In early 2023, the jet was sold for $260,000 on what would have been the singer's 88th birthday. 4. Soviet walking excavator. Most people are unaware of the existence of a bizarre vehicle called the walking excavator. Also known as a spider excavator, these construction machines have leg or arm-like extensions, sometimes with wheels which move in increments, hence the term walking. The walking excavator was invented for use on steep inclines, uneven terrain, and other positions that are inaccessible to conventional excavators. Its design and movement also spreads the weight of exceptionally heavy loads that would otherwise cause the machine to sink into the ground. The Soviet Union developed some of the largest ever walking excavators. Their designs proved to be both durable and reliable, and the machines are still built and used in Russia and around the world today. But it seems as though manufacturers have scaled back somewhat on the size of these vehicles, perhaps because the largest ones simply weren't needed by many people. In recent years, footage of someone operating a rusting walking excavator went viral on social media. At first glance, the vehicle looks so old that it's hard to believe it could still run, but as it slowly starts to move, it becomes clear that the machine is still functional. It was reportedly built around 1979 and appears to be sitting in a large open field somewhere in the former Soviet Union. Unfortunately, some of the exact details of the machine are conflicting between sources, and any other information on the vehicle has proven difficult to find. 3. Ilyushin IL-76. In 2011, a pair of earthquakes devastated eastern Turkey, killing over 600 people and destroying thousands of buildings. Among those who delivered aid was a Soviet-built Ilyushin IL-76 that was dispatched by the now-defunct SkyGeorgia airline. Built in 1984, the 153-foot-long 4-engine strategic airlifter was used primarily for cargo. After dropping off a shipment of humanitarian supplies at Erzurum Airport, the plane clipped the wing of another IL-76 while being towed back to the runway. It was then rendered unairworthy and was parked outside the airport with plans to repair it and resume operations as usual. But there were issues with the insurance company, so that never ended up happening. The aircraft subsequently spent the next 11 years languishing in place, while the Georgian government took no apparent efforts to retrieve it. But in 2022, the Turkish government announced plans to auction off the nearly 40-year-old IL-76 at auction, with bids starting at just 400,000 Turkish lira, or around $21,500 US. While the plane's condition certainly didn't improve while it sat there neglected for over a decade, it was in better condition than many abandoned aircraft, because the cockpit was kept covered. Unfortunately though, it's not entirely clear whether a buyer was found or how much they paid for the plane. 2. U-475 Black Widow. Foxtrot B-39, also known by its current name U-475 Black Widow, was a Soviet Navy submarine of the Foxtrot class. During the first part of its career in the late 1960s, the 302-foot-long ship served in the Baltic Fleet and was based at Latvia's capital Riga. Later on, the submarine was used for training crews from overseas who would be navigating Foxtrot submarines for their country's navies. U-475 remained in service for 27 years until it was decommissioned in 1994. It was then sold to a private buyer who gave the sub its current name. It was later moored in London near the Thames Barrier, where it operated as a floating maritime museum. A few years later, in 1998, the submarine was moved to the waters off the port town of Folkestone, where it remained open to the public. But in 2004, it was moved for a final time to the River Medway near Rochester, England, where it's been sitting in a state of disrepair ever since. There are reportedly plans to restore the Black Widow, but it's unclear when the work is slated to begin. For now, it continues to languish in the river, where it flies the Ukrainian flag to show where its owner's support lies in the current conflict. 1. Roadside Locomotive. Along a quiet highway in rural Indiana, there's a dilapidated old Amtrak locomotive that clearly hasn't moved in years. It's covered in rust and chipped paint, and several of the windows, doors, and headlights are missing. According to a post on Facebook's Abandoned and Forgotten Indiana page, the locomotive sits along Highway 54 outside the small town of Duggar, which is home to just 900 residents. Unfortunately, the post didn't include any other information about the train. In a bid to learn more about it, a writer for local radio station 103 GBF did some digging online and concluded that the locomotive is most likely a Turboliner RTG. Built during the early 1970s, Amtrak's first batch of RTGs operated along routes throughout the American Midwest. While it's unclear how long the roadside train has sat abandoned at its current site, it may have entered service as many as 50 years ago, and it looks like it could have been left to decay not too long after that. Would you rather take a flight on Elvis Presley's jet or journey into the depths of the ocean on a submarine? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.